Hello and welcome back as we continue our discussion of AWS application and messaging services. In this lesson, we are going to focus on workflow management and talk specifically about AWS Simple Workflow. So over here in the Orion papers, let's click on Simple Workflow and then onto Simple Workflow Essentials. And let's now get a good working understanding of what Simple Workflow is. And we can also find that over here in the AWS console by clicking here under Application Services on SWF. So Simple Workflow, or SWF, is a fully managed workflow service provided by AWS. A simple workflow allows an architect or developer to implement distributed asynchronous applications as a workflow. A workflow coordinates and manages the execution of activities that can be run asynchronously across multiple computing devices. Simple Workflow has consistent execution. It guarantees the order in which tasks are executed, unlike with SQS, which has no promise of order. And there are also no duplicate tasks, which is also something that SQS cannot promise either. The Simple Workflow service is primarily an API which an application can integrate its workflow service into. This allows the service to be used by non-AWS services, such as an on-premise data center. And a workflow execution can last up to 1 year. Now, what are the components of a simple workflow? Well, there's 4 main components. There's a workflow, activities, tasks, and a worker. So first, a workflow is a sequence of steps required to perform a specific task. A workflow is also commonly referred to as a decider. Activities are a single step or unit of work in the workflow. Tasks are what interact with the workers that are part of the workflow, and there's 2 types of tasks. There's an activity task, and this tells the worker to perform a function, and then there's the decision task, and this tells the decider the state of the workflow execution, which allows the decider to determine the next activity to be performed. And lastly, we have the worker, and the worker is responsible for receiving a task and taking an action on it. And a worker can be any type of a component, such as an EC2 instance or even a person. So now let's jump back out to our diagram here and talk about a simple workflow and how all these components work together. So it's important to understand that a workflow is basically a job that is followed from start to finish, and it follows a specific sequence of steps. So here's an example of a workflow for processing an e-commerce order. So when the order comes in, the workflow or the decider will decide what the first activity will be. So in this particular example, the first activity would be to verify the order. They will then send an activity task to the worker. The worker in this specific example is an instance for this task. The instance will then verify the order and then send the decision task back to the workflow so that the workflow as the decider can then verify that it has been completed and then move the workflow forward to the next activity. The next activity then being to charge the customer's credit card. And then it repeats the same process of sending the task to the worker, receiving a task back from the worker, and then moving through the workflow. Now, when we get to something like ship order here, this is where our worker can be not just an EC2 instance, but also, say, an employee. So let's say this is a warehouse now where we get to a point in the workflow where a physical person has to go to a specific location within the warehouse, pull the item off a shelf, and physically pack it into a box. Once completed, the employee will then enter into a computer or some sort of a device that has been completed, and the decision task will then go back to the workflow or the decider, and we can then move forward within the workflow. And this repeats until we get to the end, and then it becomes the end of the workflow. Now, this does provide for a decoupled workflow or decoupled architecture because each one of these can still work independently of the other if one were to go down. So if the instance verifying the orders go down, anything that's still in the workflow or that is in front of it can still continue down the workflow. All of these steps do not require that this has to be working as long as it has passed through this particular task. So although it is different in how it works from SQS, it is still similar in the fact that both SQS and Simple Workflow allowed for decoupled or distributed architecture. So again, what we should remember about Simple Workflow is that it is composed of a workflow, activities, tasks, and a worker. The workflow is commonly referred to as the decider. The activity are the steps within the workflow. There are two types of tasks, an activity task and a decision task, and then a worker can be an EC2 instance or even a person. So with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.